What is the true purpose and meaning behind UFOs? Why is their supposed extraterrestrial origin being promoted by the establishment? And could this all be part of a cover-up to hide the true reality that we are, in fact, seeing some form of demonic manifestation? And I'm joined by Father Spiridon Bailey. Delighted to have you here, Father. It's really good to have you on.
It's very good to see you. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Now, obviously, you're a prolific author and YouTuber. I encourage everyone to go and check out your channel on YouTube for a variety of different topics. But your latest book is called The UFO Deception. Got it right here, and that will be the subject of our discussion today. Now, before we get into the true reality, the purpose behind UFOs, behind so-called alien visitation, you start the book with a story about how your wife saw a UFO in Rotherham, actually, near Sheffield, where I used to live, where I was brought up. Tell us what happened during that UFO sighting.
Yes, this was back in 1978. My wife, who I've been married to now for 32 years, she was then a teenager traveling with her parents to a New Year's party. And they saw initially a light in the distance across the fields. They were on a stretch of road where there weren't many houses, so they could see this thing very clearly. Her dad started joking about it being some kind of UFO. But then as it got closer, they all got very quiet, and it actually drew alongside them, the other side of the hedge in the air, and she described it as the length of about a double-decker bus, about 30 feet or so off the ground, completely smooth, no seals, no visible rivets, but clearly solid, something very solid. And as it had moved through the air, she described how it left a trail of light through the air that remained for some time. Now, this thing remained still. It drew close to them and then stayed there. And almost disbelieving her own eyes, she described to me how she looked at her parents and actually questioned them and said, "Are you seeing this? Are you seeing this?" And they nodded and said yes. And then her dad was about to get out of the car, and they stopped him, and he sat still. And then this thing just slowly began to move away, constantly maintaining a kind of fixed distance above the ground, and then it shot off at incredible speed. And they had no interest in the subject at all, and they were initially very shocked. They went on to a New Year's party, and my wife's mother then immediately began to tell everybody what had happened, and it became the big joke of the evening, you know, that they'd seen a UFO, and everybody was ridiculing them. And my wife then, a couple of days later, saw in the newspaper, and she kept the newspaper cutting all across the country in 1978, late December 1978. These things had been seen up and down the country, very similar descriptions that she had experienced. And she kept the cutting and put it away, never thought about it. And then as I was reading a book related to the subject, I brought it up, and she mentioned the sighting. And it had not created an interest in her. She hadn't pursued the subject. It was just a very strange experience, one that left her really unsure what it was the experience was. She didn't have an easy explanation for it. But she put this newspaper cutting away, folded it up, and then all these years later, she dug it out, showed it to me, and related to the book that I've been reading. I thought, well, this is something worth investigating.
And you mentioned there the initial reaction to when she told everyone else at the party was one of ridicule. That was very much, in my mind, how the topic was treated up until probably, I'd say about 20 years ago, maybe 25 years ago, because I was obsessed with this topic, as I told you before the show started, as a teenager. As far back as the mid to late 90s, I would literally go and hang out in Waterstones and read all the UFO books. I would record on VHS tapes every single UFO alien documentary show that was on Sky Television at the time. And it was very interesting because we had a Newsweek poll in 1996, for example, which found that only 20% of Americans believed UFOs were extraterrestrial visitors. 51%, a far larger portion, thought that they had a natural scientific explanation. You fast forward to today in 2022, they did the same poll. Not long ago, actually, it was YouGov did a similar poll about a week ago. And it found that 34% now, up from 20%, believe that they're extraterrestrial in origin, and only 32%, so fewer people, believe that there's a natural scientific explanation behind UFOs. And of course, other percentages, smaller percentages, believe other things. But again, the largest portion believe that they're from other galaxies, other planets, call it what you will, but on a terrestrial plane, intergalactic. Now, back in the 90s, when I was into this subject, apart from the dedicated ufologists, the researchers, the true believers, you might call them, who are actually very open to only one side of the argument, the establishment treatment of this subject, the media treatment, the legacy media treatment, and governments, their view towards UFOs and aliens, their view towards UFO and alien eyewitnesses was not great, to say the least. They faced ridicule, they faced embarrassment, they faced public shaming. And the general line back right up until the late 90s was that people who see UFOs and aliens are basically crazy. They don't exist. There's no conspiracy behind it. People are just misidentifying lights in the sky and stuff like this. Now, you flip forward to today, Father. We have the Navy with the whole Tic Tac incident that people talk about, basically coming out and saying, yes, UFOs are real. We can't identify some of them, suggesting in some cases they may even be alien. We've got the Pentagon making similar noises. We've got congressional hearings into the subject. Did something change at the end of the 90s, Father, or do you think the treatment of this subject going from being ridiculed and debunked to now being given mainstream legitimacy was just part of this process of gradually socially engineering the public to believe that ET was visiting Earth? And if so, why would they be interested in doing that?
Yes. Well, there is absolutely, without doubt, because documents have been released under freedom of information and so on, there is a narrative, a line of treatment that we can see within official departments of various military and government agencies. You go back to 1952 when Project Blue Book began. It eventually gave its report called the Condon Report in 1968. Now, members of that project have since said they were advised to choose the least representative or least realistic and believable cases to present, to promote. The CIA involvement was revealed to have shown that they included the media. Disney was on board. There were all forms of media intentionally ridiculing the idea of it being some kind of even a real phenomenon in itself, let alone the explanation of it. Now, this debunking was being promoted continuously, and there are people on the record. There is an Ohio congressman, William Ayers, who in the 1950s pushed for congressional investigations, and he reported in the 1950s that the CIA and various bodies were actively undermining reports. They were putting pressure on pilots, military personnel who tried to make observations public. The NSA has been involved, and the NSA, of course, has had even up to today parts of their reports withheld from Freedom of Information Acts. So initially, right through the 60s, right through 50s, 60s, into the early 70s and so on, we see a deliberate attempt to debunk. And then we're trying to answer questions here about things, obviously, that we cannot ultimately get to the bottom to. Why this approach changed, we couldn't say. We could say over time, maybe a plan has been in process, as you describe, a preparation has been put into place. Certainly, Jacques Vallée, who was played by Truffaut in the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind, he said in the early 70s and then in the mid-70s that the CIA was working deliberately, and he saw that film Close Encounters of the Third Kind as a part of this, as preparation of leading to something, some kind of disclosure, some kind of preparation within the culture, within the social psyche to accept this information and to transform people's understanding and perception of what actually was taking place. Because there was a growing recognition that something was taking place. There was a phenomena of some kind. Too many people and too many military and respected people were beginning to speak out. And so maybe that was part of the process of revealing information, or maybe it was simply the weight of evidence was forcing an approach to change. That we couldn't say, or I can't say personally. But certainly by the mid-70s, there'd been a change, and the use of particularly Hollywood television series, the promotion of the idea of the visitation of extraterrestrials and so on. This was beginning to be pushed, beginning to be made more acceptable to the general public. Absolutely.
And again, the difference is so stark from those, late 90s documentaries that I would watch, that I would keep and record, to now where it's wall-to-wall UFO documentaries. They're real, they're aliens. This is what we're bombarded with by these corporations, these giant media corporations. This isn't an organic grassroots narrative that we're hearing. This is what's being imposed on us from above. You've got someone like Bob Lazar, for example, who was one of these guys who claimed to work at Area 51 on alien technology. He went from, in the late 80s, being this guy who was persecuted. He lost his job. He was ridiculed. He was harassed by so-called government agents. Now, he's got his own Netflix movie about him. He's on Joe Rogan's podcast. These people, in many cases, can get fame out of this. You mentioned the pilots. Decades ago, they wouldn't report UFO sightings because they were threatened that they'd lose their jobs. Now, many of them are keen to do so because in some cases they can become online celebrities at least for a brief time, or they can, make coin out of it. Then we've got the question itself, which you cover in the book about, are we alone in the universe? All this technology we've sent into the cosmos, and bear in mind, this is as UFOs, an extraterrestrial origin, is being promoted more and more, and yet we seem to have less and less evidence that suggests that they are coming from elsewhere in the galaxy. All the radio signals, all the probes we've sent out, presumably all the signals and probes that have been sent in our direction, if there are these intergalactic species. And yet, it seems it is pretty lonely out there, right? It's 2022. We've had zero confirmation of intelligent extraterrestrial life. And yet belief, not only in the existence of ET, but the argument that they're visiting Earth, is growing every single year, despite a total lack of evidence to suggest that. Seems pretty unscientific to me, which is, that's the interesting argument behind it. The more science disproves intelligent life or is unable to get that proof, the more people believe in it. It's pretty bizarre. Do you think this increasing belief in aliens, specifically in the Western world, is to some extent a desperate attempt by the Western population to replace what they've lost to a greater extent, which is faith in God?
Yes, and I think your question relates a lot to some of the points that you made there as well. If you look at the activities of SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, one of the big promoters that, as we know, is Carl Sagan, who was Carl Sagan, who's now died. He said categorically, the search for extraterrestrials, the search for life beyond Earth, is the search for who we are. He related the search for alien life as a philosophical question about our own nature, existence, and what we are. Now, SETI has had millions of dollars, absolutely millions, a huge fortune, and principally from private investors as well, including Steven Spielberg. They've searched the skies, and they've come up with nothing. There's this huge silence, and this is the great paradox. Exactly as you say, how much evidence or negative evidence is necessary to prove a hypothesis is wrong? If you take the hypothesis that there is life out there, to what point do you keep going when there is no scientific proof? We face this vast silence from space, despite all the technological advances we have. a vast silence, which a lot of people within SETI have said is a very strange thing. They cannot account for it. They search not just obviously for messages, but signs of industrial activity out in space, emissions of radiation that might be abnormal, this kind of thing. And there's nothing, absolutely nothing. Now, for people like Carl Sagan, the real problem with this was, well, I should say, first of all, Carl Sagan completely rejected the idea that we were being visited. Even Carl Sagan, who had a very clear sense of the size of the cosmos, let alone our own galaxy, he had no preconceptions about this. He said he did not believe for a minute that technologically any race or any form of life could possibly make that journey. That distance is so great. So his hope was, well, just simply to discover life beyond Earth would somehow be able to prove that life itself has a source other than the Christian tradition of being created. If you look at the writings of Carl Sagan, he quotes from Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, Chinese philosophy, and so on. But his real target is traditional Christian faith. He clearly detested it. In fact, he goes to great lengths to mock it at times, very openly. And there is clearly a philosophy, a desire to give an account for life on Earth beyond it being created. Now, I don't want to get into, unless you're happy to, but I don't want to get into the issue of evolution as such, because I realize that's a completely different subject. But the idea that if life is nothing more than an accidental mixture of chemicals, and although, of course, there isn't a scientist on Earth who can account for how even the strangest and most unusual mix of chemicals and forces can produce life itself. It isn't something we can account for. But if we can say, look, life exists elsewhere in whatever form, then the philosophical argument then that, oh, well, it is a random event that just happened to be here. And so for Carl Sagan, it was about removing the specialness of Earth. Time and again, he referred to the Earth as this small blue point in space of nothing of consequence. When the Voyager spacecraft was turned and photographed Earth from this huge distance, the furthest point that the Earth had been photographed from before, and it appeared as this pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan described it, he almost leapt for joy that he could reduce the planet Earth to this little insignificant corner of the universe, as he described it. So this reduction of the Earth and the reduction of life itself to something that is really insignificant has this philosophical basis behind it. Now, the second part of what you're saying, I completely agree with. We are living at a time when, particularly since the mid-60s to the mid-70s, there's been a growth in what many people refer to as spiritual inquiry, particularly what we would call the New Age, I suppose. New Age beliefs, New Age ideas. People be far more receptive to ideas of meditation and yoga and various Hindu practices. So with the discarding of traditional faith, traditional values, traditional belief, instead of just falling into an atheism of some sort, the vacuum has been filled with this mishmash of ideas and belief. And I think UFOs fits into this very, very easily, because it answers all kinds of longings, in a sense. If you don't have a traditional Christian faith, if you don't believe that there is something unique and special to human beings and to life on Earth itself, if you don't believe that we are created, that there is a divine order and so on, then the belief that life could be elsewhere, that it could have been evolving for millions of years before us, that it could be technologically and, as they often say, spiritually more advanced than us, and therefore may come with answers, may come with solutions to our problems. It becomes a very attractive thing, especially when the human race, particularly here in the West, we see it almost on a 3 or 4 month kind of cycle now. We are stumbling from one great threat, one great fear to the next. If it's not climate change or a pandemic or a war that could spread and become nuclear, we are seeing the media promoting a constant fear, And so this state of anxiety, this state of longing for security and for something to come with a solution, I think will only grow. And so the promotion then of UFOs as something beyond, as something other, something that can offer, something that we are in need of, I think becomes more attractive. And I do think that is not an accident. I think this is being very clearly manipulated. And I think the evidence is there in not only those pieces of information released through Freedom of Information, but through the research of people like Timothy Good and the writings of Jacques Vallée, even to some extent, although I wouldn't accept what he says very much, Stephen Greer, the things he's saying. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with you. Sorry, I hope that answer wasn't too long.
No, that was great. And yeah, it just reminded me of what's happening now. We talk about people having this God-shaped hole, this desperation for some kind of meaning. You see it in beliefs about simulation theory, which of course, if you track them back to their source, is essentially a belief that there is a creator, but that it's just aliens in some computer science lab in a different galaxy or a different dimension. You see now with, you mentioned there, fears over nuclear annihilation tend to coincide with increases in UFO sightings. I see this now today with people saying, oh, I'm not worried about there being a nuclear war over Ukraine, Russia, because the aliens would come and they would stop it. So it's this belief in this off-galaxy creator controller that can come in, and if humanity is about to mess up on a grand scale, can rescue us. So it is a kind of imposter religion for the 21st century, I would say. But then again, as you explain in your book, far from providing enlightenment, peace of mind, righteousness, purpose, which you could argue is the function, one of the functions of religion at least, people who encounter these UFOs, alleged alien abductions, they only seem to experience, in the aftermath, misery and confusion, right?
Well, that point of view as well is reinforced by people who've embraced UFOs and the idea of extraterrestrials. You look at people like Dr. Alan Hynek, who worked for the government in America. He was one of the original scientists working in the investigation of UFOs. He has said himself that the encounters with UFOs invariably produce symptoms of depression, emotional and psychological disturbance. It can result in marital breakdowns. So there is clearly a danger here, there's something going on that is harmful. There is, I have his name written down because my memory for names is terrible, just a moment. Robert Schaefer. Robert Schaefer was an investigator who looked at the parallels between UFO encounters and witchcraft. And he found this huge correlation. Not just the people who were involved as well. He found over 60% of all UFO encounters are with women. Over 60% are college graduates. But 63% of them had previously had some kind of experience either in New Age or occult practices. And then there have been pieces of research done that show that ritual abuse, the parallels between ritual abuse and then the descriptions of abductees, and I'd like to talk about abductees in a moment, but the experiences themselves have so many parallels, some kind of strange beings, often very odd sexual activities that take place. And these procedures that are performed in a paradigm where it's being proposed that these visitors are highly advanced technologically, the medical procedures that they are described performing on people are incredibly barbaric and basic. So there is a mismatch. Jacques Vallée, who I mentioned earlier, he talked about the confusion, and there is a paradox he described in the encounters where he ultimately saw the whole phenomena as something positive, as transforming human culture and human understanding. And he believed that in order to do it, or he proposed this anyway, those who are visiting, he suggested, create confusion, create paradox, because it is through symbolism and imagery that they are able to lead people on. But he He himself, he wrote a book called Dimensions. He acknowledges that UFO experiences are deceiving people, and this is coming from somebody who absolutely supports and embraces the phenomenon. He said there is a deception going on. So much of what the so-called visitors are saying is contradictory. So much of it is pointless, meaningless. He describes one encounter of someone, this being apparently stepped from a spaceship, as he believed, and was asked, "What time is it?" And he answered, "Well, it's 2:30. And the being said, "No, it is 4 o'clock," and stared at him very meaningfully, and off he went. And Jacques Vallée suddenly interprets this as, but then he's questioning the nature of time and space, and he's teaching us something beyond this. Whereas in fact, as we know, when the human mind is faced with riddles that are unsolvable, it enters into a condition that's far more susceptible to hypnosis. That's why so many of these adverts are using unsolvable, strange images and questions, because the brain goes into the state of receiving information in a far more suggestible way.
Now, you have this report quoted in your book, The UFO Deception, which, again, excellent book for everybody who wants to get their hands on a copy of that, from the Library of Congress for the U.S. Air Force. And this is in your book. The U.S. Air Force Office of Scientific Research report says, quote, "Many of the UFO reports now being published in the popular press recount alleged incidents that are strikingly similar to demonic possession and psychic phenomena which have long been known to theologians." And then from your book, you summarize this, quote, "Where once the demons presented themselves as angels, now in a culture that has lost its connection with the Christian faith, they take on the form of extraterrestrials." Finishing up your comments about alien abduction, and then just give us a brief overview of the Orthodox Church's stance on what UFOs and aliens truly represent in the context of that demonic manifestation.
Right. Well, if we look at the writings of the early church fathers, and also in lots of the liturgies and services for the burials and passing of the dead and so on, we see reference to the aerial realms. And the aerial realms is that space. It's literally that space above us. We could say the skies and the heavens and so on. And in traditional Christianity, this is the location of the demonic presence. And we have lots of saints. You can go to the work of St. John Chrysostom, St. John Cassian, St. Athanasius. Lots of saints refer to the demonic presence in the aerial realms. This is their location. Now, when we talk about the demons, we're talking about beings that are not strictly spirit in the sense that God is. Christianity teaches only God is truly spirit, but they are of a less density than we are. So they're not contained by the material realm as we are. So they are able to move far more quickly from one place to another and so on. And they, as the scriptures say, and as many saints have confirmed, they can take on the form even of an angel of light, we're told and warned. So they can appear in any form, and they can interact physically. And this is the case also for angels. We should just remember this, that when the angels appeared to Abraham, he thought they were normal men, and they ate and they drank with him. They had what he perceived as a physical presence. Now, some people who argue that, well, UFOs can't be this because they leave kind of physical impact on the ground, or they have some physical effect. Well, this is certainly not discounted by this, because demonic forces and even angels have been known to do this. Now, if we look back, certainly through the 18th and 19th century, we have lots of accounts of people experiencing what they perceived as demonic. Because if you want to use just sociological terminology, the paradigm in which we interpret our events and experiences, throughout Christian history, people have interpreted these encounters as demonic. They've seen them as demonic, and the presence has taken on the form resembling angels and so on, and in some cases very terrifying demons. If you look at the life of St. Anthony of the Desert, certainly he reached such a spiritual state that he did encounter, and they revealed themselves exactly as they were. As our culture has changed, those appearances and their impacts have continued, but the form often that they take and the interpretation then becomes one of our contemporary culture. Now, as we've moved into a more technological age, if we like, we've become more open to the idea of giving a technological interpretation to these events. And so we shouldn't be surprised, many modern day elders and saints have told us, that will be the means with which they seek to deceive us. If you go back, the very first start, the very beginning of when they were interpreted as something technological was really about 1933 in Sweden, and they were called ghost ships. And there were these strange torpedo-shaped things seen passing through the sky. Of course, rockets and torpedoes were in their very early stages then, and this was the interpretation. And then as time has gone on, it's been a purely technological thing, and people have interpreted them, yes, as some kind of spacecraft containing beings. And certainly the writers and investigators like Timothy Good went purely down that road to begin with. But then as our own culture shifted, as people have entered into this paradigm of the New Age and embracing more Eastern traditions, Hindu traditions and so on, there's a strange kind of spiritual interpretation that's been adopted. And this has been reinforced actually by a lot of UFO investigators themselves. Jacques Vallée, he started his work in computing. He made a lot of money, and he was a very well-respected scientist in the field of computing. And so he brought a lot of credence to what he was saying. But the more he investigated, the more he realized the appearance, the activity, the movement of these things could not be accounted for as any kind of technological system. It simply couldn't have been a ship of some kind. And so he was the one who then started leading his investigations into ideas of interdimensional beings. He came up with the thing called the interdimensional hypothesis. He moved away what was always called the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And he became a bit of an outsider even within UFO circles. And that was in the mid-70s. And the more he promoted that, the more he talked about it, the more other members of the UFO community have accepted it. And we've reached a point now where the promoter of these things, Dr. Stephen Greer, he actually has embraced it to such a point where he says you must enter into states of meditation. There are spiritual conditions on the experience of these beings and these craft. And if you enter into certain spiritual states, you enter into a means of actually communicating in greater depth with these ships. Now, for orthodoxy, we would say these are all signs of a spiritual deception. We can see clearly there has been disinformation been coming out, and the stories have changed from the CIA, the naval intelligence and so on. But alongside that deception, which is a man-made deception, I personally, this is just an opinion, I personally believe that particular deception has simply been very, very simply to conceal military aircraft. They're testing their military aircraft. They need a cover story, and this story has fit very well. But alongside that, there is another reality which I believe the CIA, the military people are fully aware of, and they certainly can't explain it. They can't account for it fully, but they are using it for their own purposes. We in the Orthodox Church would simply say, well, sorry, go on. I've lost you again.
Yeah, just picking up on that. Just picking up on that. Yeah, the recording's fine, actually. It's going to continue recording at my end, so don't worry about it. It should be fine. Just picking up on that, yeah. You mentioned the characteristics of UFOs that suggest they're not physical nuts and bolts objects. They flash in and out of existence. They merge into each other. All these reports from, radar, from pilots of them just blobbing into each other, flashing in and out of planes of existence, suggesting that they're not physical, they're not intergalactic. What does the Bible say about UFOs? Are UFOs mentioned in the Bible? And is that demonic interpretation very much evident in the Bible? And, from what people have said, analysts of the Bible, scholars of the Bible in the years after it was published, what is the Bible interpretation of UFOs, these appearances and visitations?
There isn't a reference, perhaps we wouldn't be surprised, in the Holy Scriptures to any kind of extraterrestrials or beings. There is in the letter to the Ephesians a reference to demonic forces in the aerial realms, the wickedness in high places. Lots of church fathers have talked about this wickedness in high places as being this aerial realm, the location in which the demons live and move and are active. There are accounts, even from the very first and second centuries of the Christian church, of people having experiences of the effects of demonic presence, which have direct parallels with things people describe through UFO encounters. The effects of loss of time, the sudden movement from one place to another, intense lights, all of these characteristics that people today from our culture would immediately interpret as a UFO, we see there in the very early church.
Now, I want to move on to, before I do move on, actually, I wanted to ask, is it the Orthodox Church's position, is it your view that all manifestations of the paranormal, so whether it's ghosts, poltergeist, whatever, are actually manifestations of demonic entities? Because again, you mentioned this in the book, there are millions and millions of UFO sightings if you collate them throughout the history of UFO sightings. Way too many, you would suggest, for this to be an intergalactic visitation. Same thing with things like ghosts. There are so many ghost sightings, but then if you want to account for all the people that have ever lived on Earth, the billions and billions, then there'd be ghosts walking around everywhere, right? Plus the reports of sightings of ghosts always tend to play onto the fears of the cultural narrative at the time, whether that be the old grey lady as a classic example and things like that. So they always intersect with what the culture believes a ghost should look like. You very rarely see, Viking ghosts or Anglo-Saxon ghosts, but you will see Roman ghosts, for example, simply because that's more heightened in our culture. So do you think you could put UFOs and aliens in the same box as all, quote, paranormal experiences, ghost or whatever, as demonic entities with a broad brush? That's what you would call them. Would you include everything in that category?
For our own spiritual safety, absolutely. The recent church fathers and church fathers from the very beginning of the history of the church have warned us from tasting or experimenting or exploring any kind of what we call spiritual activity beyond that of faith and obedience to God. The reason for this, well, there's a number of reasons, but one of the main reasons is we are unaware, we're very easily deceived. The church fathers talk about the human psyche, the human person, as being almost layered. And now demonic activity cannot have awareness or access to our very core being, our inner self. They cannot read our deepest thoughts and so on. But the church fathers teach that the very externals of our being and our consciousness is where imagination sits. And this is where fantasy, temptation, images can be prompted, where we can be led astray. Which is why in Orthodox tradition we say even the use of imagination in prayer is very dangerous. We can be led astray. If we start seeing visions, we start seeing lights, the church fathers categorically say turn away. There are writings in the church fathers of monks who they believe have been visited by angels, and the angels have the monks have refused them. They said, leave me. It's not simply worth risking encountering and communicating with a demonic presence. If God wishes me to know something, he will let me know. So yes, categorically, absolutely. We are very vulnerable creatures. We are very sinful creatures. And we look in this life, in this materialistic world, for sensations and pleasures and experiences. And if we allow that desire for sensationalism experience to roll over into our spiritual life, then we kind of walk blindly with our hands open for anybody to pop something in. And the demons will rush to fill our hands and fill us with experiences. That is why the Church Fathers also say something that apparently seems good. The demons can mimic miracles, they can mimic healings, all these kinds of things. We are to be wary of everything and anything of that nature. Because, in humility, if we recognize ourselves as unworthy of any kind of these experiences, if we say to ourselves, look, I am not a saint. I have not reached these spiritual heights. There are people who've fasted and prayed for 50, 60 years in a monastery who don't have these kind of encounters or experiences. Who am I, so filled with sin and worldly passions, to imagine that, I can just immediately start experiencing these spiritual pleasures and visions. So we are to guard ourselves. But can I just say one thing about the issue of ghosts as well? Yeah. The first thing is, if our loved ones, when they die, were to be left roaming around on the earth, what a horror that would be for us, to think of those loved ones who have died still somehow just wandering here, there and everywhere, retained in the world. But the Church Fathers teaches very specific. We know what happens with the dead. We don't believe that death overcomes us. There is life beyond death, and we have a foretaste of our eternal reward. So the Church is very clear on what does happen to us. It is a mystery in one sense that the fullness of it isn't revealed yet until we die, but in another sense, God has revealed enough to us that we don't have to fear.
Now, a lot of this messaging from these entities, demons, call them what you will again, kind of mirrors the same kind of rhetoric we hear from the global elite, the Illuminati, call them what you will, specifically around the area of environmentalism. There's this idea that we need a global government, we need to dissolve sovereignty to face down these environmental catastrophes that we're apparently creating as humans. That is a constant invocation. That is a constant narrative you hear these alien abductees talk about. The necessity for a one world government, a one world religion. Kind of very convenient that matches up with precisely what the globalists, as I call them, want. And that kind of suggests that they have hijacked this entire ET alien religion simply to push the same narrative about the supposed destiny of humanity that they want too, which is about centralizing power, which is about stripping nations of sovereignty, which is about making people godless. There's also, in the conspiracy world, this kind of long-running premise that there's going to be the ultimate false flag, which will be the fake alien invasion. Now, I think you mentioned this in the book. Again, something that unites humanity around a universal threat, which necessitates a global government, a new world order. Did you come across any information in your studies as to the likelihood of them pulling that stunt, that kind of fake, hostile alien invasion? Or is it more likely that the so-called alien invaders will be portrayed as, benevolent helpers of humanity rather than hostile invaders? If one of those scenarios was to happen, which one do you think the demons would try to deceive us with?
That's clearly a question I'm not capable of answering, which of these tricks they like to pull. And certainly our government agencies and those people who are running the show, they're going to keep those kind of secrets close to their chest. They're not even going to, slip out in disinformation. But I think you're absolutely right. If you look at lots of writings of people like Jacques Vallée, they talk about what I would call a pseudo-union of humanity, a union where national boundaries, national identities are removed, and they promote it as a very positive thing. Look, this will bring an end to war, there will be brotherly love and so on. But from an Orthodox perspective, we would say this is a pseudo-union and a pseudo-harmony, a pseudo-brotherhood. Because unless it's based in truth, and we believe that the truth is faith in God and the shared doctrines of God, then it is not truth at all. It is not harmony, and it is not union. There is no union outside of God, we believe. We can create things. As terrible as the communists were, and believe me, the church in Russia knows only too well how terrible the communists were. There were people involved in that who believed that they were trying to organize some kind of utopia on earth. I'm sure they can't have all been 100% absolutely evil in their intention. But we see manifestly when human beings try to organize populations around social construction, when governments try to take control in that way, when we remove freedom from human beings, it always ends in disaster and often genocide. The control that we are seeing promoted through this globalism, I think is a massive threat. Now, I think the alien and the UFO, whether it be as friends or foe, potential appearance, whether it happens or not, whether they decide to go down a different road, who knows? But if they promote this idea, I think the end game of globalism and the end game of a one world government is absolutely what we should expect. We do believe, if we look at history, things like the French Revolution, although it had ended by the time he came into power, the philosophy, the intention was personified in Napoleon. We see Nazism personified in Hitler. All these movements, these social and political movements throughout history have a leader, a figurehead. Globalism will have a figurehead. Christianity believes that there will be a man who is so given over to evil that he embodies evil itself. He will not be Satan, but he will be Satan's man. He will be the Antichrist. And globalism will need a figurehead like every social movement. And we shouldn't be surprised if globalism itself is personified in the Antichrist. When and how long we've got to wait for that, if it's 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, clearly we don't know. But that makes absolute sense, and it's in line both with Holy Scriptures and the teachings of the Church Fathers.
Now, moving on to an overlapping topic, I would suggest, because the Vatican has promoted, specifically Pope Francis, environmentalism, global governance. I mean, I've made videos about Pope Francis, his comments about him wanting big tech to censor, quote, conspiracy theories, which is very dangerous. His comments about Islamism, for example, after the Charlie Hebdo massacre, he rhetorically supported the terrorists, I would argue, by saying, well, if somebody was rude to your mother, then you'd attack them as well. He literally said comments to that effect. We have the Pope, the Vatican, promoting the mass migration of non-Christians into Christian nations. I believe that they're part of this global governance, this takeover, not Catholics in general, obviously, not the Catholic Church, but certain elements that have seized control of the Catholic Church and the Vatican. Has the Vatican also played a role in amplifying this extraterrestrial explanation behind UFOs and also a general acceptance that alien visitation is happening, that it's real and that it's not demonic, that it's actually intergalactic and we need to kind of work with it, not against it?
Absolutely. In 2005, the head Vatican astronomer, Guy Consolmango, I think I pronounced it right, he said categorically that the Roman Catholic Church believes that extraterrestrial life will be encountered. And that was in 2005. And then more recently, Pope Francis himself, he was addressing the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. And he said, when the alien visitors, if they come, when they appear, we will baptize them and welcome them into the church. So the idea of life beyond this planet has absolutely been embraced by Roman Catholicism. But can I just add one thing as well with your comment about the whole mass migration thing? When we look at history, the feudal system in this country was really the back of it was broken by the plague, the Black Death. Workers became so few that they were able to withhold their work, demand better pay. The fewer there were of them, the better it was for them. And I'm not saying the Black Death was a good thing, clearly, but it broke the back of the feudal system. We see the reverse happening. The people who are affected worst by mass migration in Europe are those people who are unskilled, the people who are at the lowest level, status level in society. They are the most vulnerable to this. The people who benefit are those very wealthy industrialists, people who can move large numbers of people around, not have to pay long-term investment into them or pensions and so on. And they use them as fodder, work fodder, cheap labor. So, and it certainly does, with mass migration, break traditional values, traditional belief systems in any one particular place. You can see this in certain cities in this country, and I'm not criticizing in any way any particular groups. In some ways, many of these migrants are themselves the victims of this system. And I say to myself, if I was in their situation, I may well try to illegally get to another place. That is not to say it's a good thing. I think it's having a terrible negative effect. But I'm not criticizing or attacking the individuals who are doing it. But when we see masses of young men, and predominantly this huge migration is young men, pouring into particular places because they meet a working need, or because a population is falling in that particular country, perhaps because of abortion, perhaps because of a lack of support of families and so on, then we can see that it is a political and it is an economic decision. That is not happening by accident. So I completely agree with you on that.
Well, and it's the case is, as we saw in the UK, 4 out of 10 of the boat migrants who are arriving on the shores of England are from Albania, a country that isn't at war. They're not refugees in many cases. The vast majority are men. And they've created a lot of problems in areas of crime, areas of sexual assault across Europe. And then, I did a story a couple of weeks ago where 4 out of 5 of what they call refugees. And by the way, actual genuine refugees are harmed when large numbers of economic migrants are taking the resources that should be laid aside for real refugees. But in Sweden, they had a case where 4 out of 5 of the refugees who had arrived in Sweden, mainly from the Middle East and North Africa, were then going back to their native countries and holidaying, having vacations, and then coming back to Sweden again to pick up their benefits and their welfare. So again, we see a system being completely abused at that level as well. But very shocking to me that someone like the Pope, who is supposed to be the defender of the faith in Europe, would openly lobby for and become an activist for, again, what you described, which is a top-down policy by the global elite to exploit cheap labour, and I would argue to dilute and weaken national identity, because, again, that's in their interest for sovereignty to be diluted, because then these transnational interests find it far easier to take over. And again, I find it very concerning that the Pope, Francis, has pushed for that. And he's also pushed for a lot of weird global governance stuff, a lot of Gaia as the new kind of religion, and tried to tie it into the Catholic Church, when I think the Catholic Church, any Christian church, should be very much sounding the alarm bell against those kind of threats.
I think also, as you described, the interests of these international bodies, for them, national identity is something of a stumbling block. They need to remove it. When people are connected, when they have a sense of connection within their nation, they are stronger, they have their own traditions. And as an Orthodox person, I would say our national character, our national identity, the culture and the way human beings are so different, and we are so different, and not better or worse than anyone else, but we each have this glimmer and this hint of something of humanity that can be very different in places, and of course a shared humanity. There's something very special and I think blessed about that, but it is being removed. It is being diluted completely and utterly and broken. I'll land on that one.
Yeah, well, I think we've done an hour now, Father, so we can wrap it up there. Before we go, though, again, I urge everyone to get the UFO Deception, excellent new book, which I think this came out last year, right? Was when it was published, 2021. Right. But before you go, tell people where they can find your work online, because some people might not know you're a very prolific and successful YouTuber. You have a channel. Tell us about your YouTube channel.
Well, I do have a channel. It's simply called Father Spiridon. Essentially, it's a version of my weekly sermons from church for those people, because Orthodoxy in the UK is often very scattered and not everybody could make it to church on a Sunday. It was just a useful way of people catching up and really linking in with what was going on in church. And then it kind of grew from there, really. And then my books, of course, are on Amazon. Thank you.
You can find the books on Amazon. You've got your YouTube channel. Is there a website that you have your work presented on a website?
I don't have a personal website, but if you visit Feed a Read, they sell my books directly as well. But that's very kind of you to bring that up. Thank you.
No worries. I'll put all those links in the description. And really appreciate the time, Father Spiridon. We've covered a lot of ground there over the course of about an hour. It's been absolutely fascinating, as I knew it would be from reading your outstanding book. But Father, I appreciate the time, and hopefully we'll speak again in the future.
Thank you very much, and God bless you, Paul.
God bless you too. Thank you.